I'm Kirsten Baumgart-Turner, and this is Sustainable Hawaii, streaming live every Tuesday from 12 noon to 1 p.m. at thinktechhawaii.com. Today we're going to discuss Honolulu's planning responses to climate change and any other questions you might have if you call in to our new hotline number, 415-871-2474, or tweet us at thinktechhi. My guest today is the director of the City and County of Honolulu's Department of Planning and Permitting, Mr. George Atta. He's been at the helm of the DPP for nearly 3 years now, guiding Oahu's long-range regional and community sustainability planning. He also helps regulate the development and use of land on Oahu, and he's a member of the board of directors for HART, the Honolulu Authority for Rapid Transit, where he provides expertise on all kinds of transit-oriented development. Welcome, George, to our show.
Thank you for having me.
I know that you ran over here from Honolulu Hale, where you're having a very important cabinet meeting, so
yes,
thank you for making the effort.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, it was, the mayor has had a lot of things on his agenda, so the meeting lasted a little longer than usual.
Well, we're delighted that you've made time for us to talk about particularly sea level rise, and we're wanting to know how the winter storms, both their frequency and their intensity, have impacted how the city and county is doing its planning work. And
well, and those incidents actually have not changed anything. I mean, if anything, maybe they've emphasized the importance of these issues, but we've been seeing this for coming for a while. And so on both the general plan update and the development plan and sustainable communities plans, we've inserted language about sea level rise and climate change. And so it's those are the really long-range planning documents. And so that's been an effort that's been going on for a couple of years now. And what the winter storms did, and actually the previous year when there were 4 Category 4 hurricanes in the Pacific at the same time, those are unprecedented climate situations. All they do is emphasize what we've already known, that climate change is happening and that it is a long-term process, but these events basically give validity to the fact that it's not just speculation and hypothetical. We're seeing the effects of climate change.
Right. The general plan update has been in the works for a long time. It's 15 years ago, right, that it was
last time
updated?
it was done,
Yeah.
yes. It's supposed to be updated every 10 years, but it's been taking a long time. And
so is it in the process now?
It is.
Okay.
Actually, the process was already started when I came on board. And at that time, the feeling was that let's just do it, but and that I wasn't going to make much input into it. But when I looked at it, there were certain things I did want to add to it. The climate change emphasis is one thing I wanted to strengthen in the document. The document 10 years ago doesn't really talk about those things in any detail, so we added language in the general plan. It's currently going through what's called the second public review draft phase. So it went through one public review period a couple of years ago, and then we should be getting the second public review draft by this summer. I think it's just coming to a pre-final stage, and in another month or two, it should be out for the public for review.
So what are some of the major differences when you insert the climate change issues into the general plan? What does that mean with the plan itself? What are we going to see that's different?
Well, the plan itself is just, the general plan is largely text, and so you'll just see increased text language about paying attention to climate change and sea level rise and things like that. The real crux of the issue for us is really when it goes beyond the general plan and beyond even the development plans and sustainable community plans down to the individual zoning and how we administer the special management areas, coastal zones, things. That's really where the old saw that the devil is in the details. I mean, we all know it's coming. We all know are getting ready, but in the details, how do you address it? And that's where the really naughty problems are, like property rights come in. And whenever you institute a regulation, it may be a logical or reasonable thing. And I'll mention this because this actually happened 20 years ago. At that time, DLU wanted to increase the shoreline setback.
The Department of Land Use.
Department of Land Utilization, before all the departments merged into DPP. They proposed a 100-foot setback from the shoreline. The state law is for 40 feet, right? So the department said, well, let's move it to 100 feet, because they already could see some of these issues coming on.
Because the erosion has really been happening this entire last 100 years on Oahu.
Yeah. And then the department wanted to push back the development line to 100 feet from 40 feet. And they got huge pushback from the property owners, especially on the North Shore.
Right.
And they really fought it. And so, because they felt it was affecting their property rights, and which is true, it would affect their property rights. And so the council didn't adopt it. So that's, it's at that level where I think the real difficulty of how to address climate change is.
And this is particularly pertinent this year because of the higher intensity and frequency of particularly the big waves on the North Shore. And we experienced, and myself included because we live up in Mokuleia now, the big waves that started on February 22nd and continued through the Eddie Aikau that week and eroded and threatened many houses, and we saw it on TV, houses falling actually down into the beach.
Right, and actually it started even before February, because if you remember, the big wave regimes actually started from late November, December, that we were getting a series of very large wave sets sustained over time. And so I think this winter, I haven't looked at the statistics, but the sense I get from talking to the lifeguards and the emergency management guys is that this winter's, the number of days in which the high wave regime came in was probably a record of some sort.
I have read actually that it was.
Yeah,
and not only that, but the sea level itself, at least in the Mokuleia and Kaihulu Bay, was so much higher than ever before, where there was no beach whatsoever and no rocks to be seen. So that when those waves came in, they did a great deal more damage and they flooded Farrington Highway. Right. So what is being proposed then? Is the setback going to be much re-proposed to be a 100-foot setback?
Right now, we don't have any definitive proposals because we're participating with the state and the federal government on several task forces and study groups to try to figure out really what is the right solution. And this is where again, even something as global as sea level rise and climate change, there is no one-size-fits-all kind of solution to the problem. I mean, trying to push development all 100 or 150 feet is one solution, but it's not practical. I mean, you have, especially on Oahu, we have a lot of built-up places. There's no way to push it 100 feet or or more, even if the science says this area is going to flood in 40, 50 years. To say, okay, now no more development, from here on in. You have issues of property taking. There's no question about that. And how
property taking meaning when the city and county condemns it and pays fair market
even
value?
by regulatory taking. What happens is when you change the land use laws that said no more building within this thing, even if we're not condemning the property, that's a regulatory taking. It's to impose a new law saying no more building makai of this line.
Right.
If that
so you're subject to litigation
you're
then.
subject to litigation. So you're depriving the landowner of reasonable use of their property. And they say, well, it's reasonable, but he's going to get flooded out in 30 years. Well, you get to use it for 30 years.
Right.
And you're saying you can't use it for 30 years. So you get into all kinds of that kind of litigation things.
So it really is a very difficult balancing act between individual property owners' rights and their investments that need to be protected, and the city and county, i.e. the taxpayers' investments, and there are also publicly owned lands that are involved. And then you have the third element, which is making sure that we're protecting lives.
Right. I mean, the
In
government's
those-
role is public safety is one of the major governmental roles. So, and in your statements, you've already mentioned a whole bunch of other things like infrastructure, which is a public responsibility. And you know, we're seeing the erosion of the highway on Ka'ava area, and the state taking emergency actions. And we know it's only temporary. How long those things will last is another question. And the other complexity that many people don't realize is that sea level rise and climate change is global, but its effect is local. I mean, sea level does not, you know, even something like sea level, you think the ocean rising, but it rises more in some places than in other places. So, you know, what if 3 feet is good in one place, it's not good in another place. So, you know, a one-size-fit-all kind of solution really doesn't work. You know, and so it's a much more complex. And so when you get down into the detail area, that's when you have to do the local studies. You have to look at the local options. Is this economically feasible or not?
And I understand that there is actually a task force. I think it's the Climate Change Adaptation Task Force.
Right.
Is that the correct name?
And DPP is a part of it. It involves federal and state and county agencies. And, so
And it's led by the Department of Land and Natural Resources and the university.
Is like a partner that they provide some of the research, and so we've been getting some of the UH research, and UH is one of the leaders in this these areas. So
Right, it's isn't it the global? I'm sorry, the coastal study group. I forget the name. Chip Fletcher will murder me for.
Well, Chip's involved in but a bunch of committees and task forces. So I mean, you know, I'm not sure he can keep track of all of the acronyms that are involved here.
So the university though is working on providing you the hard data to inform these long-term climate adaptation policies for the state and the city and county. Is that correct?
I think even when you use the word data, what they do provide, the data they provide is the baseline data, because you can only measure what's current, right?
Right.
The future is another matter, and that's where planning has to make a lot of hypothetical assumptions, and policymakers have to make projections, because even though you know, what the scientists can do is they can measure what conditions are on the ground today. What they will be in the future, 20, 30 years, is that's where all of the climate models, and you have conservative models and you know, robust models that say make a 1 meter rise, a 2 meter rise, and you know, and something like that, or even a 1 foot rise in the model. Depending on what kind of assumptions they're using, makes a huge difference on the ground. If you look at the thing, and so you know, so while they're hypothetical about the future, which model you use for policy purposes has huge implications on the ground. And so it's and because you know it's a projection, not a prediction.
Right.
It leaves policy makers, decision makers with nagging uncertainty. Did we make the right choice? Because
Well, one of the questions we get often, though, is why are we continuing to build within the new flood zones that have been determined? And those, we know a lot of people in their houses, at least in their condominiums, have objected to the increased flood zone determination, because that changes their insurance, right? And their costs. You mentioned, though, the difficulty of saying no to developers, but at what point do we just have to have that political gumption to say no more, and we're not going to foot the bill when you go under?
Well, I think unfortunately, and maybe this is the pessimistic side of me talking, but I think unless we get a disaster like Katrina or Sandy happening here, the political will is probably not there, because you know, when you get a disaster, everybody, then all of a sudden people are willing to make a change. You know,
right.
You know,
have we not learned then from Katrina and Sandy?
You know, it's one thing to see it on the news and you know, learn the lessons, but when it comes to individual properties, that, you know, people will often say, "Well, I'm willing to take the risk." Right? And you can't prevent me, and I'll sue if you prevent me, and I'm willing to take the risk. And
I understand in the meantime, though, And I know the DLNR is mostly responsible for this, but there is a city and county permitting process as well. I'm referring to sea walls all along the hardened shorelines.
Right.
So there's no more building allowed on the ocean side, as I understand it.
Yes.
Is that correct?
Well, I mean, we haven't approved the fill project out in the ocean in decades now.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so, but on the land side, and particularly on the high water mark or where the sea walls are, there are
Yeah, there's a
permits being given?
permitting process. It's usually an SMA permit to build.
The special management
yes,
area.
Permit, yeah. And that's, again, a complicated case-by-case thing, because many times on a shoreline, and I know, Kirsten, you're very familiar that the majority of the shoreline already has a hardened shoreline. There are a few properties that don't have it, and so the ones that don't have it see their beach frontage eroding, so they want to put a wall.
Right.
And we kind of, in that kind of situation, we will tend to say yes, because it's already, like 2/3 of that coast, that bay is already got hardened shoreline, and if you don't permit this guy, it'll just erode into his lot while everybody else thinks.
So we're not leaving property owners out to
high and dry.
high
right.
and dry.
But in places,
Well, actually, we're trying to leave them high and dry.
right. But yeah, so we look at each coast individually, and then if the seawall, and actually where there's space, we're actually encouraging revetments rather than seawalls, because they tend to dissipate the wave
What is
energy.
the difference? What is
Well, a
it?
seawall is more vertical barrier that essentially takes the wave energy and reflects it back out. A revetment is a sloping structure, and often many of them are rough boulders, or in Japan they have rubble kind of things, and so what it is, it's more like a rocky shoreline, and so the waves will come in and kind of dissipate its energy and then go back out without. The problem with reflecting walls is that the energy is still in the water, and that energy will go elsewhere along the coastline, and often erode the other parts of the beaches that are not protected, and so you often increase erosion by putting seawalls on an individual basis. But revetments will protect the shoreline and at least dissipate that wave energy in its effort to go over this rough inclined surface and goes back, so it doesn't reflect as much to the unprotected areas. It's less likely to cause erosion on the sides.
So is that something that perhaps the DOT might be looking into, instead of moving the roads back, which you've made very clear is very difficult? Might we be building revetments all along the coastline?
You can, where the land and space, the slope and topography is there, but it's not always possible in either the bathymetry of the ocean, of that shoreline there, that is not conducive to a revetment, because it does take more time if you make an incline, and then it does require that there be a supporting base under it, right? If the topography already is a vertical topography, a revetment, in order to put a revetment, you'd have to go inland rather than go out, because it's so much more expensive to go out into the ocean, and you have to fill more. And then so the shore side needs to have enough setback where you can put a revetment. So it's not practical in every situation, but where that's the option, we're recommending that to homeowners.
So in that discussion of not allowing, wanting not to allow more development, we also think about the things that go under the ground, not just on top of the ground.
Right.
So the sewer lines, the water lines. One of the things that we have put a moratorium on is cesspools, but we're still allowing septic tanks. Is that correct? And we're also building in Kaka'ako, which is, I understand, in the floodplain.
Well, a lot of, Kaka'ako is not the only place that's in the play, especially when you look at Chip Fletcher's latest models.
Yeah, those have come out.
It goes way inland, and so Kaka'ako just happens to be the focus because it's a lot of development there, lot of luxury. And to tell you the truth, that most of the new buildings in Kaka'ako are probably safe, because if you go and visit those projects, most of them have already taken into account the latest FEMA maps, and so they've elevated their the habitable floor above the base flood elevation.
Right.
So the buildings themselves and the sites are probably okay for the next 50 years.
What about the infrastructure underground?
Infrastructure is another thing. I think they've taken care of their infrastructure. I mean, things will be underwater. There's no question. Like sewers and water mains, they go under the street. And places like Kaka'ako, where the water table is shallow, you just need to go 2-3 feet and you'll be...
So how do we keep that out of our ocean waters?
Well, you have to encase the pipe, obviously, to prevent the leakages.
Okay.
I mean, so I think the ENV and Board of Water Supply would be better people to talk about the latest materials and technology that they are selecting to minimize potential leaks.
Okay.
Part of the problem is we have miles and miles of old pipeline that are subject to leakage, and then the problem that we're having with sea level rise is that the groundwater level is rising. And so things that were okay is now becoming flooded, and the typical would be like storm drains.
Right.
Because storm drains are supposed to take the water and then flush it into the ocean, but if the groundwater is rising, there's no place to flush it. It just kind of sits there in ponds.
Right.
And
George, you've been so illuminating. I have so many more questions. I know we had a shorter time today, but I hope you'll come back so I can finish my long list of questions, many of which are from the audience.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you.
Thank you, and thank
me.
you for being so gracious to run over here.
Okay.
Aloha. We're going to be back next Tuesday with Sustainable Hawaii from noon to 1. We look forward to seeing you.
Hawaii, 25 talk shows by 25 dedicated hosts every week, helping us to explore and understand the issues and events in and affecting our state. Great content for Hawaii from ThinkTech.